My name is Jerm. This is Germ Warfare, the battle of ideas. Riley Waggaman, aka Edward Slavsquat. Thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thanks for having me on.
Yes, we were just saying a moment ago, it's taken quite a long time to get this recording going. Months in the making.
Yeah, just a scheduling issue. You reached out to me, I guess it was, in October maybe, or November?
Well, it was when you were going through that Russian thing, which I want to chat to you about.
Yeah, it was after I'd left Russia, but basically I was living in Egypt and I had very, very poor internet. So I didn't want to subject you to that. So, yeah.
I like the fact that you were on my continent for a little bit.
I was, although I never got so south. It was, you know what? I loved Egypt. It was life-changing. I didn't really like, I did the normal tourist stuff and it was great to see the temples, but actually what I really loved was Alexandria, which is not really often visited by tourists, but it was an amazing city. And I would love to go back and maybe even, I don't know, like live part-time there maybe. I really fell in love with Alexandria. Yeah.
Egypt is a strange country in terms of Africa. I mean, it's geographically part of Africa, but it's not really Africa.
Fair enough. Yeah. Incredible country though. And it's,
I think when you talk about, yeah, go on.
No, go on. I was just going to say, if you smoke shisha, it's like the best country in the world. So.
No, I was going to say, if you talk about Africa, I think for the most part, you kind of think about sub-Saharan Africa. You don't really think about the northern region.
Sure. Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's still Africa. So congratulations on being part of the continent for a little bit. That's more than what most Americans can say.
Yeah.
Next time round, head quite far south, and I might end up meeting up with you.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
You've got a very, very interesting story. First and foremost, let's just talk about your background and your connection to Russia.
Yeah, sure. I lived in Russia. It was actually, by the time I left, I was on and off for a little more than a decade. I first arrived in, I always get the exact date wrong, but it was basically 6 to 8 months before the Edward Snowden thing, and then shortly after that, Maidan in Ukraine. And that's sort of important because, ironically, I'd come to Russia after I worked very briefly in media in Washington, D.C. I absolutely hated it. I said, I'm never returning to this horrible, cynical, disgusting industry. I did what many young Americans do when they don't know what to do with their lives, which is I just packed my bags and moved abroad to teach English. At the time, I worked a bit in Czechia, in the Czech Republic. And after doing that for a little bit, I said, I got to do something with my life. I got to mix it up. I ended up getting another teaching job, this one in Bashkortostan, the Republic of Bashkortostan, which is part of the Russian Federation, capital Ufa. I actually lived in a relatively small town that was actually closer to Tatarstan, so on the other side of the republic. And that was when, it was so funny because when I got there, I was like, I'm done with politics. I'm just sitting in Bashkortostan chilling. And that didn't turn out that way because apparently, things really popped off in Russia. It's hard to remember, but back then, 2012, Russia really wasn't it wasn't headline making news at the time. Not really. Nowhere, we're in a totally different universe now. And so things really started popping off. With the Maidan crisis and then the Crimean reunification, of course, shortly after. And I decided, I guess I should go to Moscow and start writing again because I'm in Russia and I feel like Russia's not getting a fair shake, from the stuff that I was reading. So I did move to Russia. I worked for several outlets, which I think you can safely say espoused the sort of, in reality, a sort of more Kremlin sympathetic narrative. I first worked for a little startup site called Russia Insider, which was run by some expats who had been living in Russia. Then I moved on to Press TV, which is actually Iranian state news. I was their Moscow correspondent for about a year. And then I got a job at RT working for their website. And I did that for several years. Yeah. And then when COVID came around, unfortunately, I had to accept that many of my preconceived notions about Russia, or basically, I guess the way that I approached Russia, which was I really, really hate the West and NATO. And so I'm willing to, share the so-called Russian perspective with Westerners to show there are other viewpoints on these topics, which is still true today. The problem, of course, is that now that I was living in Russia and I was experiencing what the Russian government was doing to its own people, unfortunately, during COVID, it was exactly the same as, the way that Western governments were treating Westerners. Unfortunately, though, working for RT, I was not allowed to share this information with anyone. And actually, it was very odd because I would approach people in sort of big talking heads who are apparently Russia experts. And no one really wanted to talk about it or admit the very, very serious anti-human policies that were being implemented in Russia, just as they were being implemented around the world. So I decided that I just couldn't continue working for RT. I left, and incredibly, that was in the summer of 2021. And actually, the situation just got worse. So by autumn of 2021, that's when actually the whole country they were imposing QR codes, compulsory sort of QR code health passes, CR tests to get into hospitals. There was mandatory vaccination or some form of it in every single region of Russia. And so then I was like, well, I guess it's time to really start writing about this. And so I started a blog on Substack, where I focus primarily on COVID-related stuff. And then, of course, the SMO comes, and that's when things got really wild because we had a situation where Russia had taken a series of legitimate grievances and had taken action, which unfortunately, I think we see now that we're in the 5th year of this war, that the last 4 years have only exacerbated all of the problems that existed prior to the launch of this military conflict, a very tragic military conflict that's killed an enormous amount of brotherly Slavs. And so I started covering that a little bit, but really the big change was after the SMO started, I moved to a little village in Novgorod Oblast, which is between Moscow and St. Petersburg, with my partner. We just set up a little farm. We had cows and goats and chickens. I think that my readers enjoyed my periodic updates on just very, very rural Russian life. I mean, we didn't have, for example, running water. So when we wanted to take a bath, we'd start a banya, you light the big banya, pot, and then you wait for it to heat up and you sit in the banya and steam and beat each other with the branches. I mean, it was wild. That was really a life-changing experience, and one that I feel so privileged to have experienced because it was a life that I hope that I'll be able to live again, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to live such a simple, pure, difficult, and dirty life, but it was wonderful. Unfortunately, more recently, just to wrap up this very long summary, last summer, so in last July, I had gone to the United States with my partner and my son for my son's birthday. We come back to Russia. My son and I enter Russia without a problem. My partner comes back a few days later. When she lands in Moscow, they pull her aside for additional questioning. She is interrogated for several hours. They revoke her entry stamp and tell her that she's deported. She doesn't know why.
Her name's Katya, is that right?
Well, that's her alias that she goes by. But actually, she's an American who had lived in Russia basically her entire adult life, worked as a professional translator. Yeah. Anyway, long story short, she was deported from Russia, even though she had, through a previous marriage, she has a daughter who lives in Russia, is a Russian citizen, had lived her whole life, worked in Russia, primarily in St. Petersburg. And it was just all gone in an instant. And unfortunately, it's basically because they went through her telegram and didn't like the things that she was saying. Like with me specifically, I guess that she had committed too many thought crimes. And it's really sad. And we hired a lawyer after to get some answers. And we never really got any answers as to the specific reasons for this 25-year ban. But we did end up finding out that she had been banned because before that, when she was deported, we had no idea. Like, can she return to Russia? What happened? Why did this happen? And so now we're in an appeals process. We have the same lawyer. He's trying to get more answers and try to, challenge this, I think, rather remarkable decision. But anyway, again, very long story short, I lived in Russia for more than a decade, worked for Russian state media. I guess that I'm most well known for writing I would say a compelling detail about the horrible effects of Russia's COVID policies, which, by the way, are, of course, identical anywhere you go, essentially. And had this village experience, which was incredible. Again, I feel so privileged I was able to live in that beautiful village. And now I'm searching for a new home, hopefully a new farm. So that's where I am now.
You started off by saying that you dislike the West. Why?
Basically, as an American, since the day I was born, the United States has been bombing someone or, color revolutionizing someone, or it's a system that, of course, spends a huge amount of money on destroying things. And like Russia, you have a country that's extremely wealthy, but like a 20% child poverty rate, right? Or the healthcare situation in the United States is absolutely insane. When I went back briefly, I'm not even in the United States anymore. When I went back to the United States to visit family after all this happened, I just couldn't wrap my head around how anyone could live in a country where if you get sick, you're basically financially ruined. I just don't understand how anyone can tolerate that. Yeah, you could go down the list. I just feel as if money and greed and boredom have more or less ruined the United States. That is to say, many, many amazing Americans like myself. So I'm not trying to mock, knock all American people. That's not even, it's a government. Unfortunately, it's people who've grown up in this system and think it's normal. But that's not to say that there are so many incredible, open-minded, pro-human dignity Americans. There are many. So.
I think it's fair to say that when you talk about America or Russia or China, you're largely referring to the state and the state infrastructure, not really the people.
Yeah, exactly. And the same obviously holds true with my criticism of Russia. My criticisms of Russia are directed towards state policy and how the state uses its resources and what it does with them and who controls these resources and other relations to other states and how they treat each other. And the Russian people themselves, of course, I have had bad interactions with Russians, but, wonderful people, incredible people. I strongly encourage anyone who has the means to visit Russia and hang out with some Russians. I think it's a very enriching experience when you can spend time living in another culture, especially one that is as unique and rich as the Russian culture.
You said that they went through your Telegram or Katya's Telegram. What kind of messaging were you saying?
Just making fun of like Putin and stuff, just calling him like a loser and saying, that the war was a stupid, mass calling and things like that. Nothing, the reality is that, many, many people now who cross the Russian border and probably many borders now will delete all of their chat, whether it's WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal. They delete that stuff because it's not uncommon now, at least in Russia, and I'm sure it's the same in many states. They'll just flag you maybe randomly or have some reason, and they just go through your phone now, And so, yeah, it's really wild. And what was interesting about her case specifically was that, so they go through her phone, they interrogate her, they say, okay, fine, whatever, we'll let you through. They stamp her passport saying, yeah, you can come in. They say, wait outside. We're just going to process your documents. She goes outside, waits a few more hours. The stamp has been annulled. There's a big, annulled red mark in her passport over the entry stamp. And they're like, no, you're being deported now. We changed our mind. So something happened, someone intervened. This went up the chain of command. I don't know what happened. It's quite remarkable. It's disappointing. Katya had spent her whole life in Russia, loves the country so much, and it's sad. It's really sad.
So your core argument is that Russia is no different to any other country in the sense that it's following the same sort of globalist technocratic agenda. Is that right?
There are obviously policy differences. For example, Russia if you compare like gender transition policies with the West, Russia, I would say, undoubtedly has a much more sane position on that. So there are, I would say, differences in policies that you might attribute to just being more socially conservative. I think you could say the same, though, about many countries that are even in NATO, right? So, but yes, the general idea, in my humble opinion, is that Russia is very much on board with all of the technocratic, horrors that are promoted and adopted around the world, in the West and the East. And I just find it to be not very constructive to blindly praise a government or look to a government as a beacon of hope. Like, for example, if you are part of like the
BRICS
medical freedom movement, as an example, you're on the internet, just as an example, if you're part of the medical freedom movement and you say, I'm really against compulsory vaccinations, I don't like the World Health Organization meddling in the internal affairs of how a medical policy is, made and enacted in countries. And then you say, oh, yeah, I'm absolutely against all this stuff. Unfortunately, a lot of these people have been misled into thinking that Russia specifically for some sort of alternative, which is just not true. It's just absolutely not true. And so you have to be really careful. You have to be really careful with this kind of stuff. And yeah, it's like there seems to be, I've noticed there seems to be a trend where, for example, CBDCs. Actually, I watched your last podcast that you did with your colleagues at UK Column about BRICS. And Mike Robinson made this point. He said, well, people criticize Russia for enacting CBDCs, but it was possibly necessary to do this so that Russia wasn't going to be completely cut off from, financial systems that have some way to do international transactions. Well, look, come on, let's be real here. You can make financial transactions with other countries without using a central bank digital currency. In fact, Russia is on the record. It has a domestic equivalent to SWIFT, and you can find articles even in RT International, so English language Russian state media, going back to 2018, 2019, saying Russia is already in the process of linking its domestic SWIFT equivalent to the domestic SWIFT equivalent in China and India. And in this way, we can, we don't have to use SWIFT. We can bypass SWIFT altogether. Hooray. So why can't you do that? And why turn to a technology that obviously can be abused in so many horrific ways? And if you actually look at how the Russian government talks about the digital ruble, they openly talk about how they can use the digital ruble to control social payments, right? You have a state Duma deputy, his name escapes me now, but I can pull it up for you later. He openly said, yeah, the digital ruble is great because now when we give like maternity payments, to young mothers, we can paint the digital ruble so they can't buy cigarettes. It's only used to help the child. Or, they've already talked about ways in which the CBDC can be used to control how people spend their money within the country. And of course, this is it's a centralized digital token controlled by a central bank whose head, Elvira Nabiulina, is, she was a Yale World Fellow, beloved by the IMF. This isn't necessarily I wouldn't trust any government with this kind of technology. The risk of profound abuse is just too high. And especially in a country like Russia, I don't know why anyone would give Russia the benefit of doubt when it comes to abusing power. I mean, historically, unfortunately, it's the reality. Russia has a long history of totalitarian governments using power to abuse people. That's just the reality. So, that's just one of many examples I can point to. But yeah, to answer your question, you shouldn't look to Russia as a beacon of hope if you're afraid or worried about the West, turning into this technocratic hellhole.
That's a good point. I was thinking back now to the COVID era, and I remember everybody was going on about mRNA this and mRNA that, and I didn't get jabbed and my wife didn't, and we didn't even get a PCR test. And then people going, yeah, but you see in Russia, they've got their own one, Sputnik, but it's still a vaccine.
Not only is it still a vaccine, it was developed in partnership with AstraZeneca. So I remember at the time, I mean, it was really painful to experience, but at the time, there was a very a narrative that was being pushed on disaffected Westerners, which was big pharma vax bad, Russian or Chinese vax good. I don't know anything about the Chinese vax, so I'm not even going to talk about it. But I can tell you a lot about the Russian vaccine. Sputnik V was developed in cooperation with Big Pharma, with Western Big Pharma. It was developed. They signed a document. Kirill Dmitriev, who is now the head negotiator for the Ukraine, U.S., Russia, peace talks. He's the head of something called the Russia Direct Investment Fund. He is a former WEF Young Global Leader. He was educated at Stanford University and Harvard Business School. He worked for Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and Company. He's an interesting guy. Anyway, so this guy who heads Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund signs a document with AstraZeneca and Russian pharmaceutical companies saying that we are going to transfer the technology from AstraZeneca's shot to Russia. We're going to work with AstraZeneca. We're going to produce it domestically for export to the global south, which they did for, I guess, about a year and a half. Later on in December of 2000, that was before Sputnik V was even announced. Later on in, I believe it was December of 2020, AstraZeneca signs a memorandum of understanding with the Russian Direct Investment Fund, the Gamaleya Center, which is allegedly the producer of Sputnik V, and the Russian government. They all get together. And Putin is part of this little virtual conference. And they say, we're so excited, we're going to start testing Sputnik V and AstraZeneca together to make like this wonder drug. Well, we have one dose of Sputnik V and one dose of AstraZeneca, and we think that this is going to give us the best results, the safest, most effective shot. Putin publicly says to the CEO of AstraZeneca, I wish you well in the international market as well as the Russian market. Alexander Ginsburg, the alleged developer of Sputnik V, says that AstraZeneca and Sputnik V are virtually identical and use basically the same technology. I mean, there's like a lot of evidence to point to the fact that Sputnik V is basically the same as the big pharma shot developed by the Swedish British psychopath big pharma company.
Top of that, you also had in Russia QR codes and all the other craziness of the COVID era.
We absolutely did. Basically, what happened was if they first tested it in Moscow in the summer of 2021, to the great credit of the Russian people, and this is another thing that I really loved about living in Russia, was that Russian Muscovites were so fed up with this that they basically had to use a QR code. You had to be tested every 72 hours, or your QR code would show that you had been vaxxed. And if you have this QR code, you can go into businesses, go to restaurants, etc. Muscovites didn't want anything to do with it. They stopped going to restaurants. It was a huge economic calamity. Some huge number of restaurants were forced to basically close their doors. And the mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, was forced to reverse the decision. So he ended that experiment after 2 weeks, which was wonderful. But again, that was not the Russian government. That was the Russian people. The Russian government wanted to cattle tag everyone. But then, unfortunately, in autumn of the same year, you had every single region in Russia adopt some form of compulsory vaccination, whether it was through the workplace, like every workplace had to meet a quota, like 60% of the workforce had to be vaccinated, or whether it was you needed to be vaccinated in order to attend university, or there were many professions where you were simply required to be vaccinated in some industries. And on top of that, again, they introduced these QR codes across the country. Now, enforcement depended on where you were. There was a lot of uproar against it. It was extremely unpopular. I can attest that there was a very lively black market for fake PCR tests and vax passes to get around these policies. But what's really quite frightening is actually, despite how unpopular this policy was, they eventually moved on to try to create a national QR code, like a national vax pass. And incredibly, this proposed legislation in the State Duma, so at the federal level, not regional level, was publicly endorsed by Vladimir Putin. He said, look, I understand a lot of people think I shouldn't support something like this, but I'm the president and I need to, it's my responsibility to make sure everyone's safe and healthy. So yeah, I'm on board with this. It was incredible. It was shocking, really, to many people that he would come out and publicly endorse something like that. Thank God it was so unpopular that they basically had to shelve the legislation. But yeah, this idea that Russia bypassed this stuff, that the Russian government had no part in it, is just, it's false. So I don't know why, thankfully, this false information has died down a little bit, but you still see it pop up, and it's just not true. It's just absolutely false.
I think it's maybe, human psychology. People are looking for a way out. People are looking for some sort of savior.
Okay, yeah, no doubt. To that, I would just say life is a beautiful...
look at MAGA. It's all about Trump, the Messiah.
Right. Well, you're talking about sort of like the white hat QAnon phenomenon, right? Yeah, of course, this guy, I don't know how they're spinning this now, that Trump is clearly just a puppet of, some Mossad blackmail scheme and is carpet bombing Iran. I don't know how they're spinning that into America first, but I'm sure they're trying to. But yeah, look, people, it's just the reality is that you will see a country do something, or a government do something that is truly horrific and horrendous, and then you'll have people who really want to believe in this government, and they will just find some way to justify it. They will create a scenario that exists only in their mind why this is necessary or even a good thing. And so, look, again, I'm not trying to single out Mike Robinson here. I hear this argument a lot, but again, returning to the CBDC thing, I'm not convinced by this argument that CBDC bad for West, but some reason CBDC good or even justified if it's implemented in the East. I think that's ridiculous, because what you're doing is you're assigning sort of like a moral or pragmatic justification for something that no government should have. It's just, we shouldn't trust any power structure with this kind of technology. And especially when you see how explicit the Russian government has been with understanding that how this kind of technology can be used for control, like controlling the domestic population. I don't see how you can make the case that it's necessary to impose something just so you can, trade with China, which Russia can do already. So I just find that to be not a very convincing way of interpreting why the East and West adopt very similar policies.
I think what you're highlighting is there is a huge overlap when it comes to the technocratic Agenda 2030 goal and ambitions of pretty much all the countries. And yet at the same time, there are cultural differences, as you pointed out. Like the US seems to be immensely degenerate. From my perspective, living on the African continent, I just see, Hollywood, TikTok, OnlyFans, men wanting to be women, etc., etc. And I see, Iran, China, Russia not going down those roads. And I think people struggle to compartmentalize these various aspects. Would you agree with that?
I would. And I guess I absolutely agree with that. The cultural differences between Russia and the United States are significant. That being said, I would say that Russia also is, by and large, a very materialistic state. Russians love their nice cars. They like their big houses. To me, that's just human nature, I guess. People like nice things. And so, unfortunately, I do think that a lot of what you could blame it on the West, but whatever this modern lifestyle of needing to consume is definitely prevalent, of course, especially in the large cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. There are cultural differences. There are cultural differences, though, between the United States and Poland. Poland is a NATO state, right? I don't like NATO, but actually Poland is quite a conservative Catholic state. So it's hard to, Turkey is actually extremely conservative. Turkey is also a NATO state. So yeah, it's important not to paint with a wide brush. I'm not saying that Russia, the experience in Russia that is going to be different than in the United States in the cultural aspect. That doesn't mean, though, that the power structures really care about the common guy in the street.
Now, I want to point out, I said China there, but I agree with you. China itself is also quite materialistic.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been. I'm sure it's a fascinating country with many wonderful things and also things that need to be fixed and problems, It's like, that's how it is.
But I mean, yeah, so I mean, okay, so this is where it gets very blurry now, because again, you're needing to separate the state from the people, because as you said earlier, there are amazing Russians and people should go to Russia. In the same way there are amazing Americans, and I suppose people should go to America too. I don't know. I've never been.
I wouldn't recommend it.
In other words, push it down the list a bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, how do you then approach the world in which you live? Because it does appear that Agenda 2030, aka the Great Reset, aka Build Back Better, aka the New World Order, seems unstoppable.
Okay, but so I guess I would answer this by pointing to this. I guess it's a very common thing that I hear. I think you brought it up with Hrove when you spoke with him a few days ago about how, if you have this view of the world where all the governments are the same, isn't that quite black-pilling? And so what's the point, Well, I'll just answer from my own perspective, which is I'm not a statist. I don't worship the state. So why I don't pretend to be in power. I don't pretend that I'll ever be in power. My own personal views would be extremely radical to power. So, for example, I don't believe in government mandated education. Actually, I think the education system modern education system largely has created most of the problems in the world, basically through government controlled, brainwashing of our children. I'm very, very anti-war on all levels. Don't believe in, large corporations being able to suck up resources and sell them to the highest bidder, things like that. Just a random list of things that I don't particularly like. And I have no expectation that anyone in power would ever listen to anything I had to say on these subjects. And so what I find drives me and gets me up every morning is just finding other people who I can experience the many wonderful things about life with. I'm blessed to have a son and a partner. I did have a little farm with some potatoes and cows and goats. I don't anymore, but I'm sure I will in the future. And just live my life like trying to enjoy the things that life gives me. And, for better or worse, just living through it. I don't ask for anything more than that. And yeah.
It actually, to some degree, sounds like you're a bit of a Rothbardian.
Maybe, I don't know. Look, it's just I'm not looking.
I'm not saying that as a critique. I think I am also. I'm a huge fan of Rothbard.
I'm just not looking. I have zero expectations for government at this point in my life, having seen the horrible things that multiple governments have done firsthand, basically. And it doesn't, I'm not here to pretend that there's going to be someone in power who cares about me. I just don't think that's true. I think it's a very naive way of looking at the world, actually. Yeah.
So what you're arguing is that the Russian government is effectively complicit in the Great Reset, and as such is not your friend.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Many of the major lists on the Great Reset agenda could not be possible without the Russian government's cooperation or complicity. COVID is the perfect example. COVID would have never worked unless Russia got on board. You can go down even with stuff like the green agenda and sustainability. Well, how are you going to make stuff like that work if the people who can have all the oil reserves aren't on board? So you see situations like within Russia specifically, but actually basically every BRICS nation at this point, at the major ones, India, China, I believe Brazil is in the works, are also developing carbon markets. These carbon markets they've already talked about how they're going to be integrated into the European Union carbon mechanism system. Eventually, I'm sure, into other, carbon market systems as well. Whether they're doing it out of pragmatism or whatever, again, I don't attach some sort of moral judgment on these things. If I think that a carbon market is bad, carbon market is bad. And Russia plays along with this stuff too, or not even play along, participates in it. Yeah.
This is the thing that, I mean, sorry, but this is the thing that often comes up as the counter response. How does that level with the fact that there are obvious differences in geopolitics between, let's say, Russia and the US, in terms of war even?
In what sense?
Well, so Russia, well, let's talk about Ukraine for a second, because I am extremely confused by what's going on there. It was supposed to have been 6 to 12 months and then back home. What has it been now? 5 years?
We're entering the 5th year.
What is going on? I mean, it's starting to look very weirdly like Agenda 2030-ish kind of stuff.
You know, possibly. Look, I have always approached this conflict from the perspective of the Kremlin and what it claims to want to accomplish in Ukraine, right? So all you got to do, if you want to understand where we are, sort of, what's the status of this conflict, all you have to do is go back to Putin's address on February 24th, 2022. And he says, look, we're launching the special military Ukraine. We have a few things we want to do. First of all, we're going to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. The denazification thing was, there's many ways to interpret it. Putin actually later said that by denazification, he meant ensuring that Ukraine had legislation on the books that would prevent the glorification of Nazi, Germany or just anything Nazi related in the country. Demilitarization, I think, is more or less clear. It means less military hardware, less guns, less, violent posturing against Russia. He said the other thing, we're going in to protect the people of Donbass and bring justice to those who, have been committing, he uses the word, I believe, genocide in Donbass for the last 8 years. He also says that NATO's eastward expansion has become essentially an existential threat for Russia, and that particularly NATO's movement into Ukraine, particularly with the potential of deploying short, medium-range missiles or long-range missiles in Ukraine aimed at Russia, would be totally unacceptable. And finally, as sort of a broad mission, was this idea that Ukraine has been, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has been slowly but steadily sort of torn away from Russia by the West through all sorts of very cynical schemes, and that it would be unacceptable for Ukraine to become an anti-Russia. It's okay for Ukraine to be a separate country, but to become an anti-Russia would be unacceptable, and that he strongly believed that Ukrainians and Russians are one people and that walls should not be put up to divide them. All that sounds pretty reasonable to me. The problem, unfortunately, is that now we have entered the 5th year of this war. And again, as I mentioned very briefly when we started our discussion, if you go down that list of objectives, all the problems that existed, all the things that need to be solved, have just gotten worse over the last 5 years. So very, very briefly, NATO expansion. NATO has added 2 new members. Ukraine is now able to fly drones through NATO airspace, like in Estonia and Finland, to hit targets, very, very valuable targets, like its Baltic ports, flying Ukrainian drones through NATO airspace to hit targets in Russia. And NATO has expanded. NATO has armed Ukraine to the titties, like this country has never had more weaponry in its history. It's incredible. Like, it's shocking with the missile launches. It's now a reality. The thing that they were trying to prevent is now not a daily. I mean, the missile attacks are not daily. The drone attacks certainly are. And they have devastating effect on people, and not just in Donetsk, but in several regions around Russia. I mean, these drones are going further and deeper into Russia with every passing week. It's really, really terrifying. And many people now suspect that they're being launched from Kazakhstan and other countries in order to do this. As far as protecting the people of Donbass, Donbass is a giant depopulated moon crater. When you hear about some village being liberated in Donbass, it's been depopulated. It has been shelled into the ground. It's been flattened. It's sad. It's horrible to see it. And it's really, really, it's an absolutely tragic thing that has unfolded before our eyes. And what's particularly very, very disturbing is that you had Putin specifically say that he was launching this operation to bring people to justice, that had committed crimes against the people of Donbass. Presuming, he didn't mention them by name, but there are many punitive battalions that had been raised after the Maidan crisis that were sent eastward, specifically the Azov battalion, which definitely had neo-Nazi, very, very far-right members who were definitely committing crimes against humanity in Donbass. They captured several of these senior Azov leaders in Mariupol, and they were immediately exchanged for Medvedchuk, who is an oligarch who had been arrested in Ukraine. He's Putin's close friend. I believe that Putin is the godfather of Chuk's daughter, if I'm recalling that correctly. Anyway, Medvedchuk and I think 100 Russian soldiers were exchanged by Ukraine for these Azov leaders. I think it's nice that Putin got his friend back. I think it's nice that you release Russian soldiers. But if you're going to start a war in order to allegedly bring these criminals to justice, you should follow through with it. You should do what you say you're going to do.
Yeah.
It's stuff like that. Like, you see that there appears to be different priorities. And the war, as the war drags on, it seems like Russia is not willing to actually follow through with accomplishing any of its directives and the objectives. And the longer the war goes on, the more Ukrainians and Russians are killed. This idea of Russians and Ukrainians being one people, that's out the window for at least, I don't know, let's say 10 years. It's going to take a long time to heal the wounds of this horrific war, which at this point is basically just sitting in a trench and waiting for a drone to kill you. There's not going to be any big breakthroughs. If anyone's telling you that Russia's just a few weeks away from taking Odessa or like Kiev, I'm sorry, but people are living, I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are living in an alternate reality where they think that there's still something to be won. This war is a huge L for the Ukrainian and Russian people. And a lot of people have gotten rich from it. But I don't really see what's to be, what is the benefit at this point? Like, who's actually benefiting from this war continuing? I couldn't tell you.
The central bankers.
Okay, yeah, there you go. Yeah, like bankers, right? Like really, really rich assholes are benefiting.
But I think that's a very interesting bell that's going off behind you.
Sorry, it's a church bell.
I think where people are struggling to make the circle fit into the square is if Russia and NATO are colluding, why all the violence?
Well, who says they're colluding? They're not colluding. They're just competitors. But if they're competing, why do you think that they care about you? Okay, I'll give you an example. I think that this is the best example I could give if we're talking specifically about Ukraine. Up until the start of 2025, Russia was still paying Kiev to transit Russian gas across Ukraine, which was then going to the European Union. European Union, of course, fueling the slaughter of the Slavs in Ukraine and in Russia. This agreement continued until the start of 2025. Russia still exports gas to the EU through Turkstream. Not as much as it used to, but it's still operable. And you had this incredible statement from Putin, who at the end of 2020, we would love to extend this agreement with Kiev because, war is war, but we have an agreement. We have a business agreement here. So there's business and competition. And then, you could imagine a Ukrainian sitting in a trench and a Russian sitting in a trench, and they are lobbing artillery shells at each other. They're doing that horrible, I don't know if you've seen the videos of them chasing each other with the drones and crashing into each other and blowing up human beings. Really disgusting stuff. And meanwhile, the Russian government is paying the Ukrainian government to transit its gas to the people who are funding the war and fueling the war. So I don't know, why. I do think it's actually easy to separate the two, NATO and Russia will do their thing. It's not ideological. It's just resource based. It's competition. And sometimes it is let the proles kill each other. Let's make some money. It's not for us. Look, I'll even extend that. I think that you could I think it's very clear that this war, all sides are profiting from it, including the BRIC states. China is the number one, it's the number one supplier of drone components for Russia. It's also the number one, it provides more than 90% of drone components for Ukraine.
And Israel.
How do you, and Israel, thank you, yeah. And, why is it that Russia and China can't at least sanction Israel as it slaughters people in Gaza, right? I mean, China, I think, is the third largest trade partner. Israel's third largest trade partner. Russia, one of the largest coal exporters. Sanction them. Well, sanction Israel.
Yeah, but I think the answer to that regarding China, you are referring to DJI, I think. The answer, I think, regarding China, because China's a bit of an anomaly, I think they are just purely pragmatic. I don't think they care ideologically one way or the other.
I agree, but I guess that's my whole point, though. It's like, when people talk, I totally agree. I think that China's just in it. They're just doing business. But, if you want to zoom out here and bring the discussion to like, this ongoing discussion that I've seen you had on your recent podcast about BRICS and, is it the same as the West and yada, yada, yada. Look, the sort of the cold pragmatism that we see from China, I don't know if it's a huge improvement over the rather brutal pragmatism of any other country that has, businesses abroad. I can give you a concrete example because I don't like talking in these generalizations. Perfect example is the country of Djibouti. Am I pronouncing that right? In East Africa.
Yeah.
Djibouti has huge debts to China. And in 2000, I think it was 2000, I want to say 17 or 18, China was able to establish a military base there. Now, we don't know all the details, but I think it's fair to say that if you're heavily indebted to a country, you're probably more open to letting it use your land to establish a military base. There's nothing unusual about that. Djibouti also has a U.S. base. I think it has a French base too, maybe even a British one. So again, China is not it's not doing anything extraordinary, but this is the same kind of like debt trap diplomacy. And you could say that it's all pragmatic. It's just big business, international corporations trying to make a buck. I'm pretty sure, so you're in South Africa. I remember reading an article, maybe you know more about than I do, about how South Africa had to impose like 75% duties on imported Chinese steel because China was dumping steel onto the South African market and making domestic production totally there's no competition. They couldn't compete.
That's correct. Yes,
and the reason China can do that is because it overproduces, it doesn't have as much domestic demand, and its industry is subsidized by the Chinese government. So they would rather just export it even to a partner like BRICS and potentially destroy the domestic industry. And so again, it's like, are they doing it because China is evil? I don't think so. I think they're doing it because they're in the money-making business. China, it's pragmatic in a cold sense like that. So I don't know.
I like what you're saying because you are bringing reality to what is happening globally. I think it's very easy to get caught up in ideology, and it's just about, and don't get me wrong, a lot of this is about control and surveillance and depopulation, and basically putting people into mega cities so that you can create 15-minute cities, etc., etc. At the same time, you've just pointed out that a huge amount of this is also about making money and gaining power through that.
Sure. I mean, again, I don't believe in the sort of the ideological narratives, like the West stands for X, East stands for X, they're in competition because of X, Y, and Z. I think that you can really boil all this down to the obsession with money, controlling resources, obviously, which is basically the same thing as money, and governments wanting to make sure that there aren't any troublemakers that will stop this very convenient state of affairs. These systems are packaged in different ways, but you're going to get a very similar outcome. Like I guess it was a few years ago, but actually I wrote an article for Whitney Webb's Unlimited Hangout called Resetting Without Schwab. And the premise of the article was, okay, technically, the Russian government has been sanctioned or sort of blacklisted by Davos, by the World Economic Forum. They're not invited to any of the conferences anymore. Many people are very excited about this. Sure, why not? It's a horrible organization. But all I did was say, okay, Davos is out of the picture for Russia. But what is Russia? What are the policies that Russia is actually pursuing? And so all you have to do is just look at, what does the World Economic Forum say it wants to do to the world by 2030? And what does Russia want to do by the 2030? It's like the same thing. It's absolutely the same thing. And not only that, unfortunately, a lot of Russia's, well, not a lot, but some of the big names that are molding Russian policy, especially with technocratic things like, for example, digital surveillance or biometric IDs for school children, which is a thing that's happening right now in Russia. It's all being done by the CEO of Sberbank, Russia's largest bank, this guy named Herman Gref, who was a board of trustees member of the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum. He wrote the preface to the Russian language version of Klaus Schwab's The Fourth Industrial Revolution, in which he says, Klaus Schwab is this great visionary, he has these great ideas for the world. We should all listen to him very carefully, yada, yada, yada. So again, yeah, are these guys motivated, are the Davos goons motivated because they have this, I don't know, they're part of some secret cult and they worship a ancient deity or something, maybe, but I really think you just boil it down to this nasty, cold drive for money and control and making sure that people don't take your money. And so obviously Russia's on board with that agenda, especially since it's controlled also by an oligarchy. And so it's not a coincidence. I mean, it's obvious that they would pursue very similar, they would use technology in very similar ways. And so whether you want to, I guess what I don't like is when people say oh, well, you just think they're all in it together. And that's such a simplistic way of looking at the world. They're competitors who are using the same tools to accomplish the same thing, which is to curb stomp the peasants, And so on that end, again, I don't see any large power system caring at all about the peasantry.
I think you're right. I think the competition aspect is very important because they don't all necessarily sit around the same table and have a beer and go, okay, guys, this is how we're going to trick the world. Ha, ha, ha. Moo, moo, ha, ha, ha. They don't sit and do that. They obviously are competing against one another. I'm thinking perhaps of a household with, let's say, two parents trying to find the best way to take the house forward. They're competing with each other. They're having arguments and whatever else. Their overarching ambition is pointing in the same trajectory. That makes sense.
Sure, or take another example, two feuding drug cartels. So you have some dude on the corner, trying to sell you heroin, and then another cartel comes and pushes them out. Are you excited that the other cartel pushed him out? He's also selling the heroin. Then you have one cartel who had these big, lush poppy fields in Afghanistan. Another cartel comes in and steals the poppies. Oh, yay, now that cartel doesn't have the poppies and we're going to have better heroin or something. I don't know, they don't care about you. They're selling heroin.
The part that gets me, though, is the framework that they both seem to have implemented. Do you think that's by design or emergence?
Framework in what sense?
Well, if they're both competing for the same architecture, such as digital ID and CBDCs, I mean, is this by design or by emergence?
Question. So, for example, again, we keep returning to the CBDC thing. The Bank of Russia, when it announced that it was going to start working on the digital ruble, it was in October of 2022, which was right around the time when 10 other central banks announced that they were also doing this.
Ours also.
Yeah. So it was very I'm sorry, but come on. So, something's got a document that said there's this thing called CBDCs and we encourage you to do, or I don't know. I don't know exactly what happened. I'm not saying that someone pointed at every single central bank and said, you have to do this now, but isn't it a little strange that you had a dozen central banks in a few week period being yep, CBDCs just out of nowhere? I think it's a little bit odd. And so there's maybe, who knows exactly, but it's clear that they all draw inspiration from the same sources. Let's put it that way.
I asked that question because it's something that I've been grappling with personally for a long time, and that is our opposition to all of this stuff. Is it not us just being Luddites? Is this just not the nature of technological progress?
Yeah, sure. No, progress does mean basically that's how we've come to understand it, right? This is progress, and that's how it's framed. least in Russia, they always talk about how all these new technologies, like, for example, the biometric IDs for school children, is safe and convenient, right? It's progress. You don't have to worry now. Your child will be safe when they go to school. There'll be a camera that will recognize your daughter's face and will send you an SMS when she leaves school so that you'll know that she's coming home. That's progress. But like, is it though? Is it actually? One of the things that I loved about living in my little village was how seemingly, tasks like turning the water faucet and getting water actually became a task that took a little bit more time. I had to go to the local well, haul the water back home, fill up jugs. And you just saw there are other ways to live. Of course, the things that I was doing was very extreme, and I'm not saying that's like a solution. I loved it though. I absolutely loved it. But I think there is a question about how far is too far. What about like with AI? I mean, aren't we basically witnessing a situation where technology is going to replace millions of jobs? And what is that? Is that progress? Maybe it is. Like, maybe people shouldn't work as taxi drivers or whatever, food delivery people. Maybe they should be doing other things with their time. Maybe it is progress. Maybe it's a way to make humans redundant and a bunch of us get cold. Now, I don't know. But I mean, on a certain level, though, I agree with you. I don't think that there's no stopping progress. There's no stopping the progress train. It's like a human disease, it's pathological. This idea that we need to progress.
Well, I mean, I'm asking it more rhetorically because I don't know the answer. As I said, it's something that I grapple with. But I mean, Yuval Harari basically echoed what you just said, that people must become, in his view, people must become useless and just basically stay at home and do nothing.
Yeah, I think that we are definitely headed towards where many, many people are going to be considered redundant, to use the HR approved words, and what happens to them, I don't know. So, yeah.
Okay, so Riley, coming in for a landing, core thesis of this discussion is don't trust Russia simply because it isn't the West.
Don't trust any country simply because it isn't the West. Don't trust any government. And also, I would just really encourage people to think like the people, for example, with Russia. I guarantee that there are many like-minded Russians inside Russia who are also very worried about the rise of the technocratic state and, the creation of a digital concentration camp and CBDCs and all this stuff. So you should find a way, you should feel good about knowing that there are people around the world who you can, exist in solidarity with, and that it doesn't really make any sense to play defense for a government that supports everything that apparently you don't like, right? So if you're against the surveillance state, it just doesn't make sense to give the Russian government a free pass. If you're against medical tyranny, it just doesn't make sense to give the Russian government a free pass or to make up QAnon theories as to why it's somehow necessary in Russia. And again, this isn't about Russia. It's about every single country on earth. I mean, right now I'm in the EU. EU sucks. The European Union is controlled by a bunch of, maniacal bureaucrats who have created truly an impressive little, concentration camp here. But I love Europeans and I like hanging out with them. And some of them are kind of cucked, but a lot of them aren't. So I don't know. I would just encourage, instead of looking for, some guy sitting in the Kremlin or in the White House or I don't even know, the European Parliament or wherever, the Taj Mahal, just to look to the right and left of you, try to make connections with other humans who aren't obsessed with power and greed, and just live a good, honest life. And that's it,
The people to the left and right of you are not your enemies, but those above you are.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
All right. How can I follow your work?
I'm mostly just on Substack. It's edwardslavsquat.substack.com.
Riley Waggaman, Edward Slavsquat, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thanks for having me.